Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, September 9th, where I wanted to begin talking a little bit about the Gothic tradition. And also, I wanted to talk a little bit more about an element of the syllabus that we didn't have a chance to discuss, plagiarism. And I used to basically give a brief blurb about the importance of not plagiarizing. And I would talk about how plagiarism is similar to theft, but it's the theft of intellectual property, and that it's very serious. It can result in stiff classroom penalties, at the very least failing an assignment. It could even result in expulsion with a notation on your transcript that you plagiarized. And I would give two stories to encourage people not to plagiarize. The first that occurred to me very early days of my teaching, pre-internet, so I wasn't able to look on the internet to try to find where the student had plagiarized, because as many sources as exist on the internet to help students plagiarize, they're an equal number to help teachers determine if students are plagiarizing, such as Turnitin.com. So if you were to type in, let's say, a sentence or a paragraph, you could do a search, in effect, for the original source. But I couldn't rely on any of that because those elements didn't exist. What I could rely on was my memory, and it didn't take me long to figure out that the student was actually copying text from our class textbook, verbatim, with a few mechanical errors here and there. I don't know if it was because they were poor plagiarists or because they were hopeful that if there were some mechanical errors, I would be less suspicious. The better story happened around the same time, pre-internet, and it appeared in all the academic newspapers. Yes, there are academic newspapers. And it was about a middle-aged professor. That part's important, middle-aged. And he's reading a set of papers, pre-internet, realizes that something sounds familiar, and as he begins to contemplate it, he realizes that he hadn't read it before. He had actually written it himself decades earlier as an undergraduate student. It was one of his old papers. It had something to do with a fraternity that was recycling papers from former fraternity members. Um, but these two stories would hopefully encourage people not to plagiarize. And then, of course, the world changed with artificial intelligence. And I'm not saying that artificial intelligence is bad, but I am saying that one should proceed with great caution with artificial intelligence, and that I am asking that you not utilize artificial intelligence in this particular class for a host of reasons. First of all, it's sometimes not reliable. And if you look in the notes below the video, you can see that I have, under the first section about plagiarism, an article from Forbes. And there are multiple examples like this, but this one I found quite fascinating, about a lawyer using ChatGPT, and it turns out that ChatGPT was giving him incorrect information. In fact, he had asked ChatGPT to give him a list of prior cases that shared precedent, and the cases that ChatGPT was able to find were fictional, basically, even though the attorney had asked very clearly about whether or not the information was accurate. ChatGPT assured him it was, and the judge who reviewed all of this information found, by using the old-fashioned method of books and papers and so forth, that none of these court cases had existed. And this was an established attorney. The reason why I used ChatGPT was pure laziness more than anything else. So yeah, there are examples when ChatGPT gives incorrect information. I've even heard the word hallucination, which troubles me. If a chat GPT or other artificial intelligence can hallucinate, that assumes a certain level of consciousness here. And whether or not artificial intelligence can become self-aware If you are fans of the Terminator movie, then you know that things don't go so well when our technology becomes self aware. I also have just concerns about the rapidity of the changes that are occurring. These are changes that usually we would expect to see over years or decades that are happening literally over weeks, sometimes days. So certainly the artificial intelligence that I'm talking about now will be much more advanced by the ending of the semester. And, I think there are moral and there are ethical and there are also economic questions about this. How ultimately information is being used and individuals are not being compensated. Artists in particular are having artificial intelligence programs utilizing their work and basically not compensating the artists for their work. And there also is the question about what this could do to industries en masse. When I think about all of these reasons, as well as the old educator reason of trying to teach thinking skills and not having to rely on a computer or a machine, those are all of the reasons for not using ChatGPT. And if you wanted some practical reasons, because I think that people oftentimes think about using outside resources like artificial intelligence because they're concerned about their grades. But you can positively influence your grade by answering all of the discussion forum prompts and by submitting in your first paper and rewriting it for a higher grade after you get my commentary. And you could even hand in your second paper earlier enough so that you could rewrite that. Your final examination is open book, open notes. So assessments in this class have been created for success. So I hope that you aren't at all tempted. And it's one of the reasons why I am asking that you not use outside resources when you are writing your papers, that your papers will be critical papers where you are writing based on your own interpretations. And it was something that I talked about a little bit last class when I reviewed the syllabus. And as you can see, there's a note at the top of our notes below that last week's class is in the past class sessions folder, and you will see each week be retired into that folder so that you've got the current week visible on our Moodle page, which is what we've got now. And I had very hopefully had assigned some readings, though I understand people are still adding and dropping and may not necessarily have access to the text. As I had indicated last class, I will try to provide free links whenever I can find them for the readings that we're doing. The first reading is from Stephen King, Danse Macabre, and it turns out that the link that I had used last year is no longer active. It's because of copyright violation, I'm assuming. I was able to find the link. It is through the Internet Archive. You do have to sign up for it, unfortunately, but my hope is that at some point you'll be able to access Danse Macabre if you haven't already done so, either through buying the text or reading the text on reserve in the GCC library or finding an online link. And if you find any online links that are better than the links that I've been able to find, please let me know because I would be happy to share that with the class. But right now, the best I was able to find for Danse Macabre is in the Internet Archive. And I had assigned the first few chapters just to give us a bit of an overview of what the Gothic tradition is about. And that Danse Macabre actually is a medieval term. It's called the Dance of Death, the idea that there is a kind of artistry and beauty associated with death and also universality. Perhaps it is our biggest fear. Certainly, many have argued that that is our biggest fear, that it all goes down to the idea of our ceasing of life and what, if anything, occurs afterwards. I had included in the notes below in the second section a woodcut image to give you an idea of how in the medieval period they would have portrayed death and this dance of death visually You see these skeletons that happen to be dancing with one another. And death was a reality in this time, medieval period, perhaps even more so than now, just because disease was rampant, and lifespans were very short, certainly compared to contemporary times. And according to Stephen King, he sees three different levels of fear. The first being the gross out, which is revulsion, and this is the lowest. And the second being what he calls the creeps. This is a general level of anxiety, which is a mid level. And then lastly, terror, which is a fear of disestablishment. This is, according to King, the highest level. And I think we'll see in our next reading by H.P. Lovecraft that he says similar things, although he's utilizing different language. Stephen King talks about how he's not proud. He's willing to use all three of these stages of fear in order to impact his audience. And we'll see over the course of the semester different authors utilizing different pieces of either the gross out, the creeps, or terror. The fact that Stephen King is able to, I think, articulate quite well in his very colloquial style that one of the important pieces of fear and horror is that it's able to, this is a quote, examine national phobic pressure points. In other words, the anxieties of our times. And these are political, economic, sociological, psychological. In other words, that horror is literal, but then it also is symbolic. It represents something else, or it's metaphorical, again, representing something else, representational and abstract. And that by our consuming this, we can experience something that's called catharsis. This is a very old term from, if you think about Greek drama, if you know anything about Oedipus the King, there is a purging of emotion. It's the perhaps explanation as to why we might see a sad movie. Usually sadness is something that we want to avoid, but by experiencing sadness in a safe way, because we know that these are merely actors, we can purge that emotion, perhaps even cry in the theater, and then feel a certain level of relief. I think the same thing happens with fear. Real fear, or fear in real life, is something that is not pleasant. But knowing that we are scared of something that is perhaps in film or in text or that is in fantasy, allows us to experience that emotion in a safe way. Kind of dress rehearsal is what Stephen King calls it, for when we actually have to confront this within our own lives. I talk about it in much of the ways that, for instance, individuals who are thrill seekers, like roller coasters, and that they enjoy the fear and the anxiety and the thrill associated with the roller coaster, in part because the roller coaster is supposed to be safe. It's undergone safety inspections and so forth. So unless there is a very unusual situation that results in an accident, you should be able to experience that in a safe way. And if you've ever seen people who leave roller coasters, they oftentimes leave laughing. And there is a very thin line between fear and humor, as we will talk about. Nevertheless, I think you will find that there's a lot of genre bending, or blending, I should say, when we talk about fear. And there is what we call horror. And that oftentimes involves some sort of supernatural aspect, that which cannot be explained by the natural world. There also is fantasy, and that is where you are putting real world elements into a world that does not exist. Think about something like Harry Potter, for instance. Science fiction, the idea that we aren't able to experience the events, not because they're supernatural or otherworldly, but just because our science is not advanced enough so that we could develop them. And all of these, in some ways, help to explain what I'm calling and what many people call the Gothic. Um, And when we talk about Gothic literature, it is something that goes all the way back, actually, to the early days of, if you want to think about the origin of the word Gothic, it's an architectural term. And if you know anything about Gothic cathedrals with these huge spires and these um, large, majestic elements, pointed arches, and cathedrals, and so that architectural term, and also it was a historical term talking about the Goths. These were German conquerors that were seen as barbaric. We use this term to talk about the first Gothic novel coming out in 1764 by Horace Walpole, entitled The Castle of Otranto. And what was most interesting about this story is that it is the first, so it helped to establish some of the conventions associated with the Gothic that are conventions that we also expect with things like horror. Things like secret passageways and mysteries that need to be solved, and death, decay, distress, sense of victimization, omens, curses, nightmares, eerie atmosphere. What we will see is this idea of doubling. In fact, it's known as the doppelganger, where there is an other that is basically a mirror image. Possible, but not necessarily always, the idea of supernatural activity and ambiguity. So, for those of us who are skeptical, let's say, of the supernatural, there could be a natural explanation for the events. Now, in the fifth section, the notes below, I've included a link to the Castle of Otranto, and you'll notice that I have not assigned the Castle of Otranto for our readings. And one of the reasons why is because, to be quite honest, it's a poorly written text. And it begins with this supernatural helmet that seems to fall out of the sky. Yes, you heard me correctly. Um, if you wanted to read it, certainly the link is there, but I wanted to provide you with the link just so that you could access it and perhaps skim the first chapter or two. It's important because it led to the Gothic that we know of in 1800s Europe. And when we talk about the Gothic, we're usually talking about things like Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde become famous in part because of film adaptations. So film becomes incredibly important in terms of the Gothic. In fact, I even teach a class in horror film, which talks a little bit about how the Gothic tradition helped to shape horror film. Um, and the idea behind these films, the fame has come because of cinema. And according to King, these three stories, Frankenstein, Dracula, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and these are usually the seminal stories in the Gothic tradition. And if you notice, we are spending a good amount of time this semester on these three texts. King talks about how they are basically three basic stories. That Frankenstein is about this thing that can't be explained. The Dracula text is about the vampire living off of the life force of another. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a kind of werewolf or transformation story. So that you've got basically these three stories that are being retold. And that while we might fear external horror in these examples, the monster, the monstrosity from outside, the other, this also reflects the internal horrors and darkness that we experience within ourselves. And Stephen King talks about how it's oftentimes maligned and misunderstood, this genre. It's seen as very let's say adolescent. Adolescents oftentimes are attracted to things like horror film, in part because horror films examine the deviant and the taboo, and adolescents are trying to break away from their parents and doing things that, in one way or another, separate them as independent beings. In other words, doing the deviant and the tattoo, and the taboo. So, there is a kind of cyclical popularity that King notes that you might have noticed yourself, that there tends to be times of more and less popularity. It's something I definitely talk about in my CMN class about horror film, that about every decade or so, and I don't think it's a surprise that that coincides with the new generation that basically is trying to break taboos. What we see is a kind of resurgence in interest in either horror film or horror text or some combination thereof. Remember when we talk about engaging in the deviant and the taboo, normality is really a sociological concept and it's subjective. And one of my favorite texts is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. And it talks about a wonderful line that normality is a majority concept. What's considered normal is what the majority tends to deem as normal. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is an objective normality, nor is there an objective deviance or taboo. But these texts, even though they can be very they can very much challenge the norms of society. They usually end with reestablishing the status quo, where the other or the monstrosity or the evil is defeated. So in some ways they can be quite conservative, which is an irony because oftentimes conservatives are the first to critique these stories as being immoral or perhaps in one way or another damaging to the reader or to the viewer. But keep in mind, tales of evil and tales of the supernatural have existed all throughout literature. So if you're familiar with the medieval poem Beowulf and Grendel and Grendel's mom's monstrosity, or Shakespeare's Macbeth, or Hamlet, where we've got evil witches and ghosts, you'll see that there's a long literary tradition of this. And that said, the Gothic texts we are going to be reading are considered to be those texts that have helped lay the foundation for the Gothic tradition. So initially, what that's going to be is Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We'll also be, of course, reading one of the masters of the Gothic and the supernatural, Edgar Allan Poe. Atmosphere is so important in the idea of the Gothic, and it's no mistake or coincidence that this class is being offered in the fall semester because I wanted us to have the Halloween and think about how important atmosphere is for Halloween. Again, those creaky doorways and secret passageways and these spider webs and all of the other things that we tend to think of associated with Halloween really go back to a Gothic or a horror tradition. So Stephen King's writing, as I said, is very colloquial and it's very easy, I suppose, compared to H.P. Lovecraft's writing, who is another major name in the Gothic tradition, who did the same thing that Stephen King did, though he did it years earlier. And he wrote an essay, though, this time, a long essay rather than a book, and it's entitled Supernatural Horror and Literature, where he talks a little bit about his perspective of horror and supernatural literature. And I was able to find a link for you to access that for free online. So you can see in the 6th section where it says next class, I have that link there, though I've certainly ordered it for us as a text. And it's certainly something that you can reference on reserve in the GCC library as well. So I warn you right now that it's dense and try not to get frustrated nor assume that you have to understand everything that you are reading, that there are references to texts that you've never read before, honestly, that I've never read before. Lovecraft is very erudite and very well read, really an expert in the field. And we'll see as the semester progresses how both Lovecraft and King go about creating their own pieces of fiction. But these two readings at the beginning of the semester from Danse Macabre and Supernatural Horror and Literature are basically background readings to help establish a foundation so that we can understand a little bit more of the Gothic texts that we will be reading over the course of the semester, which begins with Frankenstein. So I put these texts in chronological order, and I had indicated last class that ideally what you would do is the first class that's devoted to Frankenstein, you would have the text read in its entirety, so that while we are talking about Frankenstein for 2 weeks, you're at home reading the next text. That would be the ideal way to do things, though I know life isn't always ideal. And I was fortunately able to find a free link for the text Frankenstein through Project Gutenberg. So you can see that in our last section for next class, that I've got a link for both supernatural horror and literature that you can access, as well as a link for Frankenstein. And as the semester progresses, I will continue to provide you with links for the readings that will be upcoming. I like to do it over the course of the semester because many of these links come and go, especially if they're copyright violations, as I just found a few hours earlier when I looked for my Dance Macabre link and I couldn't find it, and I had to settle for the Internet Archive. So when I'm thinking about attendance questions, I know that you may not have had an opportunity to do the reading, so I wanted to ask an attendance question today that wouldn't necessarily rely on the reading, though certainly you could utilize the reading. I've talked a little bit about the reading as well, and you can utilize that as well. But for our discussion forum, this will be due on Wednesday, the 11th. As you know, you have 48 hours in which to respond, though if you need additional time, ask me for an extension. I'll be happy to grant it to you. What frightens you? And more importantly, why? And that's really the central question, is why does that thing frighten you? Because horror and Gothic is all about fright, and trying to find those areas that frighten us in order to be able to teach and instruct us about something. So that's your attendance question. And as I had indicated, you're not required to respond to your peers' responses, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. As you will see, I will be responding to all of your responses. And if you read all of that, you'll basically get a good sense of what we would be doing in a face-to-face class. And at the second part of this class would be a class discussion. And so you can hear or at least read what your classmates would say and how I would respond to those pieces. The videos are basically the content that I would have covered in a face-to-face class. And our homework, if you will, you can see that it's basically reading, reading, reading. Eventually, we will have a first paper due, and we will talk more about that as the semester progresses. And certainly we've got these discussion forums as well. And you can see that I ended our notes below with a little cartoon that I thought was particularly applicable. And it's a table with somebody handing out lists of banned books. And then we could see that the person who takes the list is a teacher and makes that the year's reading list. And as you know, that this is a quite controversial subject and has become even more so in the last several years. And I think about Gothic texts who would probably qualify for that for a whole host of reasons. They're considered, again, to be kind of lurid and degrading. They oftentimes talk about those issues that aren't discussed in polite company, and they oftentimes are allegorical and symbolic for more important issues and themes that perhaps could be considered to be politically sensitive. So I'm not one to believe in banned books. I believe that everything should be read. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to agree with everything or that you have to support everything that you read, but you should have the ability to be exposed to it. So keep that in mind as we are going through the text for this semester. So again, your attendance or discussion forum response question is going to be what frightens you and why. Next class, I'll talk a little bit about H.P. Lovecraft. Perhaps we can also have some time to talk about our first paper. And then we will proceed into Frankenstein the following class. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.